enchanting image of the beloved of my past. Who could have painted your likeness so vividly that I gaze upon you, I speak to you, and I believe to have you here before me, as back in those beautiful days of love. The sweet nostalgia of this poetry of Alberto Donaudy, set to music by his brother Stefano, speaks to us of a time and a place long lost and so distant from us here today. I think to enter this world we need to know about Stefano Donaudy and his Palermo. Palermo, at the turn of the 20th century, was a very special place. An ancient city over 3,000 years old on the far western tip of Sicily, that mythical and enchanted island. It had seen Phoenicians, Greeks, Arabs, Normans, Romans, and finally Italians all come to its beautiful harbor. Some conquered, some left. Many stayed over the centuries and created a culture that was unique in Europe. Richard Wagner, with his entire family and entourage, visited the city in 1882. They were so enchanted by the city and the warm reception that they received from the Palermitano society that they camped out for months in the Hotel des Palmes. "The city," he said, "is in eternal spring." He completed the major part of his last great masterpiece, Parsifal, during his Palermitano sojourn. He even managed to marry off one of his daughters to a Sicilian nobleman. The city established itself as a major European capital in 1892, when it hosted a grand international exposition that was visited by all the major crowned heads of Europe. Edward VII of England, the Kaiser Wilhelm, the Austrian Emperor all visited the exposition. There was even a factory that entirely built automobiles in the city. Thanks to an economic boom based on the export of the wines of Marsala and other agricultural products, and the recent unification of Italy, a class of entrepreneurs had amassed great fortunes in a short period of time, by the end of the 19th century. The Florio family was the most prominent, with its Marsala wine business, its bank, and its many other enterprises. Like all nouveau riche, these people intended to enjoy their wealth. They built extravagant homes, commissioned luxurious yachts and works of art, and filled their evenings with sumptuous banquets, soirees, concerts, operas, both in the salons and ballrooms of their villas and in the newly built and opened Teatro Massimo and the Teatro Politeamo. Art Nouveau was the style of the time, in this Belle Époque, and Palermo had its own version of it, called Liberty, named after the luxurious fabrics imported from the English company of that name, Liberty. An entire part of the old city was razed to the ground, and a boulevard of grand villas was constructed in that Liberty style to house these new millionaires. The favorite architect was Ernesto Basile, whose exuberant reinterpretations of Arabic, Roman, and Byzantine styles can be seen in many of the villas, and the most famous one commissioned by the Florios. A riot of turrets, grand staircases, and towers seemed to be thrown together with utter abandon in these massive structures. He was also commissioned to do a number of public buildings, including the Teatro Massimo, which he completed based upon his father's designs. A favorite painter of the day was Giovanni Boldoni, a great friend of John Singer Sargent and Edgar Degas. His nickname was the Master of the Swish because of the flowing style of his brushstrokes. He spent a great deal of his time also in London and Paris, where his talents were much in demand among the doyens of high society. His subjects seemed to gravitate toward the two extreme ends of society. At one end of the social spectrum, the end that actually paid, were the portraits of the wealthy, primarily ladies, duchesses, countesses, princesses, and celebrities. And at the other end, which is where I, as a musician, suspect his personal tastes actually gravitated, actresses, ballerinas, and singers. His most famous portrait, that of Donna Franca Florio, the Queen of Palermitano society, inspired our album cover. In this painting, she insisted upon posing wearing her 7-foot string of pearls, famous all over Europe. What is it about the music of Donaudy that captivates us? The songs are permeated with a sweet nostalgia that speaks to us at both a personal and cultural level. The ability to evoke memories in the listener is critical to the success of a piece of music, or indeed, any work of art. The ancient Greeks knew this. Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, is the mother of the muses, the inspirers of all art. Italian artists are particularly susceptible to a kind of nostalgia that yearns for something lost, a past part of life, perhaps overly idealized, a place that one loved and left, or, most importantly, a lost loved one. Italian composers at the turn of the century were particularly interested in the Italian past. Ottorino Respighi dug into the repertory of lute and harpsichord music of the 1500s and 1600s to assemble his orchestral suite, The Ancient Airs and Dances, among other pieces. Ildebrando Pizzetti goes back even further and uses Gregorian church music as his inspiration. Every great Neapolitan song that we know, Torna Suriento, O Sole Mio, Malafemmina, all written at the turn of the century, aim to sound like popular songs of another era and to bring their listeners to tears. Donaudy takes this nostalgia to a higher level by giving us songs that he named Arie di Stile Antico, airs in the old style. What was the old style? Well, for Italians of his period, the turn of the 20th century, that meant the style of the composers of the 1600s and 1700s. The time when being a composer meant being an opera composer. Names that we hardly recognize today. Cimarosa, Giomelli, Galuppi, Scarlatti, Caldara, Cesti, Stradella. These were the composers of the late Baroque and the early classical period. The first bel canto period of music, written to show off the virtuosity of the human voice. Every composer in Donaudy's time would have studied this music in their conservatory training. The opera in the early 1700s was the popular medium of entertainment in Italy. Venice alone had 16 functioning theaters. Mozart, as a child, heard many of these operas during his concert tours through Italy as a child prodigy pianist. There is no question that this music he heard formed a huge part of his musical education and later inspiration, as his greatest works were to be operas written in Italian. Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, Le nozze di Figaro. All the Italian composers that we know, Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, Verdi, Puccini, studied this music so beautiful in its simplicity and form. This music is beautiful because of its very simplicity and the constraints of poetical and musical conventions. Donaudy works within these conventions, but interprets them in the sensibility of his time, the late 19th century. Donaudy left a scant historical record of his life. We know that he was born in Palermo in 1879 and that he died in Naples in 1925. We know that he studied at the Royal Conservatory and was known as a child prodigy, as his most famous song, Vaghissima Sembianza, was composed at the tender age of 13. We know that he gave voice and piano lessons. We know that he wrote chamber music for soirees in Palermo, and that he composed 6 operas, none of which has survived in the contemporary repertory. We don't even have a photograph of him. I like to imagine him as a kind of Proustian figure, diminutive, a little frail, perhaps a little mustache, intense, but a little distracted by the music in his head, spending his afternoons going from villa to villa in a carriage, giving voice and piano lessons to the little princesses of Palermo, and presenting his music at soirees and dinner parties. If not for this collection of songs, his name would have completely disappeared into the mists of history. A few of the songs were in the repertories of the great singers of what we call the Golden Age. And we have recordings of them. Enrico Caruso. Beniamino Gigli. And the divine Claudia Muzio. Donaudy calls his songs arie, but then he gives each one a subtitle to specify what kind of aria. Each one is a small, distilled emotional moment. They run the gamut from declarations of courtly love, to the suitor's shamelessly ardent pleas, to poignant laments over lost loves, with a smattering of bawdy nymph and shepherd numbers mixed in. Some are arias in the operatic sense, little dramas of emotion. Some are madrigale, songs that use vivid and clever word paintings and suggestive musical motifs. Some are canzone, more like popular songs from the Neapolitan and Sicilian countryside. And my favorite subtitle that he gives of all, the Maggiolata, a serenade to be sung under the window of one's beloved at the beginning of spring in May to entice her to come down and take a walk with you. I have known most of the famous of these songs since I was a teenager and began to work as an accompanist to singers. But I didn't really know the music until one of my professors, mentors, and dearest of friends, the great Italian opera scholar William Ashbrook, decided that if I really wanted to be an opera conductor, there were things I needed to know and certain recordings that I needed to hear. The very first recording he ever played for me was the old Columbia 78 of Claudia Muzio's rendition of O del mio amato be. I had never heard anything like this and was practically in tears by the time the old wind-up gramophone had finished playing the song. The real inspiration for this album was the month and a half that Elizabeth and I spent in Palermo when she was invited to sing Puccini's La Fanciulla del West at the Teatro Massimo. We had the privilege of walking around and working in this monument of Liberty architecture every day for weeks. And we had the chance to make new friends who took us around the city to see the art, the villas, and to soak up the atmosphere. Learning about this fascinating period of its history really seduced us into wanting to immerse ourselves in its music. When Shailin Liu invited us to present an evening of opera in the theater that bears her name in Rockport, Massachusetts, we were so struck by the beauty and acoustical perfection of the hall that we knew this was where we had to record. We hope that we have succeeded in doing Donaudy's music justice, and that his music will speak to you, too, cast its seductive spell upon you, and that you will fall in love with his Vaghissime Sembianze, his most enchanting images.